All right, now that we have covered the HTML part of our portfolio project, it's time to sprinkle our project with style using CSS. But before we get started, let's take a quick look at where we currently stand. I'm going to run the test for our personal portfolio project on freecodecamp.org. Let's copy and paste it in there. And I want to see how much we have completed and how much more we need to do. Here are the test results. We've got check marks for almost everything except for those tests that have to do with the CSS. And oops, one for the profile link element. It should have a target attribute set to blank so that it opens in a new tab. It's a simple fix, and I'll quickly add it in the code editor. I'm going to use the find shortcut, either Control F or Command F, and type in profile, and boom, jumps right to it. I will add the target equals blank right after the href attribute. VS Code completes it for me. Thank you very much. And we're ready to move over to our style sheet. Another part of the portfolio project that I don't want to skip is the number 10 requirement, which is to have the height of the welcome section equal to the height of the viewport. While there is not a program test for that, I think the idea is cool based on the example app that FreeCodeCamp provided. Let's start with these three styles. One thing I want to begin with is adding comments to the top of my style sheet and my index.html file, since I haven't done so already. Both will have my name, the title of the course, the project name, and the date. So now, just as reference for myself, I'm going to put what the requirements are for the CSS, just so that I can remember what I'm doing. The first one was to make the navigation that has the ID of navbar fixed. Okay, and then, well, it says that the navbar element should always be at the top of the viewport, and that's literally what the position fixed does. Then the second one is to have a media query. As I mentioned in the HTML video, the current mobile first design has a block display, which makes it so that the tiles line up stacked. This is because of the H2 elements, actually, which is interesting. The wireframe that I roughly put together showed that on a large screen, I want my project tiles to be in a row. The easiest way to make a row in CSS is to have the display property set to flex, especially since this is one dimension. We just have one row and that's it. And we don't have really columns, right? We don't have like, a bunch of different size columns and rows. But we don't want that until we hit a certain screen size. And so we're going to have to determine that and then create our media query. Finally, the height of the welcome area should be the height of the viewport. That's going to be super easy. And for that, we'll set the height of our welcome header to 100 VH, which is that vertical height. Now, of course, that's not the only CSS that we want to add to our page, because otherwise it's going to look super basic. So we're going to actually use the style sheet for the tribute page and take the very basic stuff. Watch what I do here. Basically, I'm taking all the main structure stuff, the universal selector, the body, main, footer, navigation and all its elements, the section, and the link selectors and properties. And then I'm copying them all right in here. I'll open up a preview to see what it looks like now. Pretty good. It has the style I chose for my other page, so it can't be that bad. Clean and simple with a modified reading area. Now that we have things looking a little more stylish, let's fix that nav bar to the top of the viewport. I'm going to add some comments at the bottom of all my other CSS to remind me that I'm creating specific styles for just the portfolio page now. In order to be able to really see what is happening with my project tiles, I am going to give them some borders. I'm going to use the class already assigned, project tile. We'll give them a height, let's say 250 pixels, and a width of 100%. The 100% is definitely what I will want to use for my mobile design because I want the width of each tile to be the same as the viewport width. But I might change the height later depending on what I choose for the images. Now I'm going to add a border. I'll do 2 pixel solid black so that I can see my elements and how they're behaving on that screen. Here we go. Add the navbar ID selector. Our first property is position with the value of fixed. The position property in CSS determines how an element is positioned within its parent container. It allows you to control the layout and placement of the element on the web page. The fixed value makes the navbar positioned relative to the viewport, the browser window. It stays fixed even when the page is scrolled. To make sure that it stays at the top right, we use a top and right property, both with values of 0. Those properties only work when the position property is used. Now we can test it and look. Hold on a sec. We encountered a little problem. When we scroll down, the navigation bar hides the header. And then when we click on the projects link, it jumps down the page, but it hides the project tile. Not cool. But fear not, we have a trick up our sleeve. We're going to use a nifty CSS property called scroll padding top on the HTML element. This property helps us adjust the scroll position and make sure our header and projects stay visible. I'll set it to 4 REM to create a nice padding at the top, and voila, problem solved with the projects link. However, the H1 element is still giving an issue by hiding behind the navigation. Let's take a look at how things are set up in our HTML. Okay, we've got the header, and then nested in the header is the navigation and the H1 element. So because of our fixed position for the nav bar, it's basically removing the nav bar from the header and placing it over everything in that fixed position, making us having to adjust the other elements to get it right. So we could do one of two things. We can make a margin top of the header for REM, like we did for the scroll padding, or we could do that as a top value by giving the header a position of relative. And since we're already working with position, I'm going to choose the latter. In my header element selector, position, relative, top for REM. That nav bar is on point for now. Let's move on to the media query. Remember from our wireframe that we are going to change the display of our tiles when the screen gets larger. The media query we use is at media only screen and min width of some min width. And then we're going to open up those curly braces. The way that we'll find the min width we want is moving into the live server so we can use the browser developer tools to inspect our screen. Then we're going to find the width that we want to change the display from block to flex. As a side note, I'm saying minimum width instead of maximum width because we're designing for mobile first. I'm imagining in today's digital age that someone is going to be browsing my site on a cell phone, which is all about scrolling vertically. And then when we're on a large screen, we want to consider capturing the attention of the reader before they have to scroll. That's what's called above the fold. And that's an old newspaper saying to entice people to buy the paper. Now we use it in web design to keep a viewer on the page. When a person leaves your page quickly, we call it bouncing. It's a measurement that marketers use to keep track of a way to determine if people like the site. So how long do they stay on it? If they stay on it for a long time, maybe they like the site. Or maybe they just really need what's on there. Anyways, I need to see at what point it starts looking weird. So I'm going to move the line between my web page and my inspect tool. And when you have the inspect tool lined up on the right, I get to move that line, and up at the very top, the first number, there's like a dimension, and it's right underneath my projects link right now. And the first number is width. And as I start moving around, the dimension gets smaller and bigger. And then I get to a point where I'm like, oh, that looks kind of weird. And for me, it's about 750 pixels. So that's the measurement I'm going to put as my min width property. So as I'm doing this, I want to share with you something that drove me crazy. And I don't want you to have to spend 2 hours on a mistake that I have made. You know, I think that's part of being a teacher, making the mistakes so that your students don't have to. I hope. So, you know how we usually put a semicolon at the end of a property value pair in CSS? Well, do not do that when we're putting it on the min width in our media query or max width or whatever. If you just have one property inside your parentheses, do not put the semicolon. And if you do, your media query will not work. And if you don't notice the red line under the semicolon, or it's not there because you're using a different code editor, then you will beat your head for hours, as I did during a live class. Okay, maybe it won't be during a live class for you, but oh my gosh, yeah, I'm traumatized. So don't do that. Moving on. So we know where we want our screen to change, and we even know that we're changing the display to flex for our tiles. But where do we put the flex property? Because of the way that things are nested in the section element, we'll want to use the beloved generic element div within our HTML to create a container that we will turn into a flexbox, thus forcing our articles wrapped in links to line up in a row. I will be careful as I add this div to make sure that the closing tag goes at the very end of the project tiles. When we add new elements in VS Code, it gets tricky because VS Code likes to complete our code for us, which is wonderful. And then we can wind up with stray tags if we're not careful. What I like to do is create the element and then cut the end tag and paste it at the end of the section that I'm wrapping. Sure, I could have easily typed those, 5 characters, but if I cut and paste, I know that I don't have extras. Okay, so then we're also going to give that div the ID of project tiles. Okay, so it's basically the plural version of the class, tile. And then we're going to add some comments to be clear on what I'm doing, right? I'm saying, hey, this is a div just for responsive design, just for the media query, because that's the interesting part about this ID. It's not going to be found in our CSS until the media query. Very common in responsive design. We also often change elements in our media queries, and sometimes we're undoing what we did previously. But in this case, for now, we're just creating this new element selector for the project tiles div that will force the elements inside to be in a flex row. So here we go. Now, remember, I'm making sure that I'm putting this ID element selector inside the opening and closing curly braces of the media query. So it's like I have a style sheet within a style sheet. And actually, speaking of, you could actually have your media query style sheet totally separate from this style sheet, because you can actually put properties like if then properties in your links inside the head element of your HTML. That is more advanced. I'm not going to actually directly teach you that, but I just stick that in your brain for some other time. So the one other thing that I'm going to do here is go ahead and put a border around our div so that we can see it and kind of see what the difference is between the elements inside that have the black border and then the div on the outside that has the green border. Right now, you can see how they're lining up. And they're lining up based on the width of those elements inside. Right now, those elements inside, remember, in the block element, they were 100% wide. They were taking up the entire viewport, minus like margins. But now, they're actually taking up 100% of the width of their element that's inside them. So H2 in this case. So the width of it is exactly the size of the H2 element. All right, so they're not taking up the entire divider. The divider is taking up the 100% of the width of its parent element, okay? And the div itself is block. It's the elements inside that are flex. We want these to take up an equal amount of space. By defining how we want these tiles to look without images, we can add the images and content that will fill the containers in the best way possible. It's much easier to go from structure and style to content. There are some great resources on Flex containers. Here's one from MDN Web Docs called Controlling the Ratios of Flex Items Along the Main Axis, a part of the CSS flexible box layout in references. And then another place where we can learn about Flex, or at least see it live, is right in the browser itself, under the browser tools. Let's go find it. And here's my divider with the flexbox. Notice that I actually get to see here the negative space that's taking up. And here's the thing, negative space is anything that doesn't have contents, and it's a design term. And it's a design term because humans like negative space. It allows the eye to relax and look at things individually. So our negative space was all on the right. Doesn't look good. We have to use the flex property flex basis to define how much space each of the elements in the flex container will take up. The flex basis property belongs to the elements that are a part of the flex container, the project tiles themselves. However, in this case, because the project tiles are an article and the links are wrapping them, the links themselves need to be given the flex basis property. So we are going to make an element selector that is the ID selector of project tiles, right? And then space A for the links inside that. And then since we want those evenly distributed, we're going to divide the space by 3. So basically 100% divided by 3 is 33%. However, I'm going to give our tiles some natural margins, so I'll say 30%. And then now they're equal widths, but they're still crowded over on the left. So to fix that, we're going to use the justify content property with a value of space between to spread our elements evenly in the container. Notice how I said in the container. So make sure that you add that property to the project tiles ID selector. And now they're nicely spaced. The final thing I want to do in our media query is change how much space that the section is taking up. Since I put restrictions on the width of sections and the main element for my tribute, those styles are transferred here. On my mobile design, it's no big deal, but at the large screen size, it feels like I could have a greater width with those images or those tiles, and it would still look nice. So I'm going to change the max width properties for section and main in the media query. First, I need to know what the max width property value is for main and section. I go up and find those in my CSS. I can, of course, use the find shortcut to get there quickly. And I see that they are both being constrained by the max width value of 600 pixels. That was for the reading area on my tribute page. Let's adjust that here. I know that a common breakpoint for browsers on large screens is about 1100 pixels. So let's try that first for both the main and section. Put the max width at 1100 pixels. And I can have the main and the section selectors just separated by a comma since they're both getting the same thing. Well, that looks really good when we start adjusting our screen. And so this only affects our page at the minimum width of 750 pixels. And that's great. That's very cool. It looks really good. Now, if we did have reading areas or we were using this same media query on the tribute page, we would have to do something different. But for now, this looks great for what we've done. We are so close to being done with the super technical stuff. Let's make our header the size of the viewport. I will use the ID element selector welcome section so that if I do use the rest of this style sheet as a template, maybe for my whole website in the future, this part will not be universal. It'll just be on this portfolio page. So I add the height of 100 VH. That's vertical height. It's basically saying 100% of the viewport. And you can see that everything shifts down. This forces that first element to take up the whole viewport. Once we make our H1 element vertically aligned, it's going to look super cool. We don't really have a direct way to vertically align elements inside other elements, so we have to get creative. The best way to do this, since we are all super fans of flexboxes now, is to have our header contents display flex. And then we'll use justify content center, justify items center, and then boom, my H1 is in the center. But now I don't really like the look of it. I want to make it more casual, like the example. I'll show you a few more tricks. First, I'm going to give my H1 header only in the welcome. So I'm going to use that ID welcome section selector, space H1, to choose the H1 in that, and I'm going to actually lighten it. So I want to make the font weight smaller. I'm going to do 400. Just looks better for me. And then I'm going to go into the HTML and make some adjustments. First of all, I'm going to make it a little bit more casual. Hey, I'm Juliette Marie. That's like my new name for myself as a designer. All right, and then I'm going to make a break, and I'm going to say, this is my web design portfolio. Well, the break is so that it goes on the next line, but I don't have to use like an actual paragraph element. If I were to use a paragraph element, they would line up side by side because of that flex. So I'm doing this. And then also that tagline, that's kind of what this is. I'm going to make it small. So I can actually wrap, it's still a part of the H1, but I can wrap it in small tags, and then it shrinks it a little bit. I could put spans around it, and I could go crazy with making this different, maybe a different color, something, and I probably want to do that, but I don't want to do that in this video. I want to change my background color. I want to add images, but I think I'm going to let you mess with that on your own. And basically our final task for this part is to get everything online. And so I'll do that in another video. You guys are doing great work.